Minnesota has a tenant-protective late fee framework with specific statutory provisions that limit what landlords can charge. The governing law is found in Minnesota Statutes, Chapter 504B, which covers landlord and tenant relations, along with general contract principles and the Minnesota Consumer Protection Statutes. If you're a landlord or tenant in Minnesota, the state provides meaningful regulation of late fees, and recent legislative activity has strengthened tenant protections further. Let's start with the key rule. Under Minnesota Statutes Section 504B 177, a landlord may charge a late fee, but the fee must meet specific requirements to be enforceable. The statute requires that the late fee be agreed to in writing as part of the lease, and that the fee be reasonable. Minnesota law specifies that an unreasonable late fee is unenforceable. While the statute does not prescribe an exact dollar cap or percentage cap, the reasonableness requirement is enforced by the courts, and Minnesota courts have been relatively strict in evaluating what constitutes a reasonable fee. Fees in the range of 5 to 8% of the monthly rent, or reasonable flat fees that correspond to the landlord's actual administrative costs, are generally defensible. Fees approaching or exceeding 10% face increasing scrutiny. Minnesota requires a grace period. Under Section 504B.177, the landlord cannot charge a late fee until the rent is more than a specified number of days past due. The statute effectively requires that the tenant be given a reasonable opportunity to pay before any fee is imposed. Most Minnesota landlords provide a grace period of at least 4 to 5 days, which satisfies the statutory expectation. The lease must clearly state the late fee terms. Under Section 504B.177, the fee must be agreed to in writing, meaning it must be documented in the rental agreement. A late fee that isn't specified in the lease is not enforceable regardless of its amount. The lease should state the rent due date, the grace period, the exact fee amount or formula, and when the fee applies. Minnesota has a specific provision that's worth highlighting. The statute states that the late fee is the exclusive remedy for late payment of rent. This means the landlord cannot charge a late fee and also claim additional damages for the same late payment. The fee replaces any other claim for damages resulting from the lateness. It's the complete compensation, not one piece of a larger claim. This exclusivity provision means the late fee must be set at a level that genuinely compensates the landlord for the costs of the late payment, because there's no other avenue to recover those costs. Setting the fee too low means the landlord absorbs some costs. Setting it too high means it's unenforceable. The fee needs to be calibrated correctly. Compounding late fees in Minnesota must satisfy the reasonableness standard. A single one-time fee after the grace period is the cleanest approach. Daily or weekly compounding charges that accumulate to a disproportionate amount would likely be deemed unreasonable. Given the statute's emphasis on reasonableness and the exclusivity provision, most Minnesota landlords use a single flat fee per late payment. Minnesota's Consumer Protection Statutes, found in Chapter 325D and Chapter 325F, provide additional enforcement mechanisms. The statutes prohibit deceptive and unfair trade practices, and excessive or improperly disclosed late fees can constitute an unfair practice. The Consumer Protection Framework provides for damages, injunctive relief, and attorney's fees, creating meaningful risk for landlords who systematically overcharge. The interaction between late fees and the eviction process in Minnesota is detailed. Minnesota's eviction process, governed by Section 504B.291 and following, requires the landlord to provide proper notice before filing for eviction. For non-payment of rent, the landlord must provide a 14-day notice. The amount demanded must be accurate and must include only legally compliant late fees. Minnesota courts scrutinize eviction filings, particularly in Hennepin County and Ramsey County, where tenant representation is increasingly common. Non-compliant late fees included in the demand give the tenant's attorney an easy target. Minnesota also has a right of redemption. the tenant can stop the eviction by paying the full amount owed before the writ of recovery is executed. The redemption amount must be calculated correctly, including only compliant fees. An inflated redemption amount that includes excessive late fees can delay the eviction and create liability for the landlord. Minnesota's recent legislative activity has expanded tenant protections in several areas. The legislature has considered and enacted various provisions affecting the landlord-tenant relationship, including enhanced notice requirements, just cause eviction provisions in certain circumstances, and restrictions on screening criteria. While these provisions don't all directly address late fees, they reflect an overall trajectory towards stronger tenant protections. Minnesota landlords should monitor legislative developments. Minneapolis and St. Paul have both enacted local tenant protections that add requirements beyond state law. Minneapolis has implemented various renter protection measures, and both cities have been at the forefront of tenant protection discussions nationally. Late fee enforcement in the Twin Cities should comply with both state law and any applicable local provisions. Minneapolis's renter protection ordinances may include provisions affecting late fee administration, notice requirements, or fee disclosures. St. Paul has enacted similar protections. Landlords in the Twin Cities should verify current local requirements. For tenants receiving Housing Choice Voucher Assistance, common in the Twin Cities and other Minnesota cities, landlords cannot charge late fees when the housing authority's portion is delayed. Minnesota prohibits source of income discrimination under the Minnesota Human Rights Act, meaning landlords cannot discriminate against voucher holders. Penalizing a voucher tenant for the authority's processing delay creates both a late fee issue and a potential discrimination claim. Minnesota limits the security deposit to 1 month's rent, with an exception for certain situations. The deposit must be returned within 21 days with interest. The landlord must provide an itemized statement of deductions. Unpaid compliant late fees can be deducted, but the deduction must be properly itemized. Failure to return the deposit within 21 days or failure to provide proper itemization can result in the landlord being liable for the full deposit amount plus a punitive penalty. Minnesota's interest requirement on security deposits means landlords must track and pay interest annually, adding administrative complexity. This detailed deposit framework means every deduction, including late fee deductions, is subject to scrutiny. Minnesota does not have a significant active duty military population. No major installations are located in the state. However, the Minnesota National Guard is one of the larger guard organizations in the country, and reserve component members may have SCRA protections when activated. The SCRA applies to any service member renting in Minnesota. From a practical standpoint, Minnesota's rental market is dominated by the Twin Cities metro, one of the most stable and economically diverse metros in the Midwest. Minneapolis is the state's largest rental market. The economy is driven by a remarkably diversified corporate base: Target, United Health Group, U.S. Bancorp, General Mills, 3M, Medtronic, and dozens of other Fortune 500 and major companies. Healthcare, technology, and higher education add depth. Rents in desirable Minneapolis neighborhoods, Uptown, North Loop, Northeast, Southwest, commonly range from $1,300 to $2,200. Most Minneapolis landlords charge flat fees in the range of $40 to $75 with a 5-day grace period. The professional tenant base, drawn from the deep corporate and healthcare employment pool, generally pays on time. Late fee enforcement is limited to a small percentage of tenants. St. Paul has a slightly more affordable market than Minneapolis, driven by state government, healthcare, education, and corporate employment. Late fee dynamics are similar to Minneapolis. The Twin Cities suburbs, Bloomington, Plymouth, Eden Prairie, Eagan, Maple Grove, Woodbury, have strong markets with professional tenant bases and low late payment rates. Suburban property management companies typically use standardized late fee provisions that comply with state law. The University of Minnesota's massive enrollment creates student demand in Dinkytown, Stadium Village, and surrounding neighborhoods. Student late payments correlate with financial aid processing. The grace period typically covers the delay. Rochester, home to the Mayo Clinic, has a tight market driven by healthcare employment. Mayo Clinic employees and visiting patients' families create strong demand. The professional workforce pays reliably. Late fee enforcement is minimal. Duluth, home to the University of Minnesota Duluth, has a moderate market with some student influence and tourism-related seasonal dynamics. St. Cloud, home to St. Cloud State University, has a similar student-influenced market. Mankato, Moorhead, Winona, and smaller Minnesota communities have more affordable markets. Late fee amounts should reflect the lower rent levels. Southern Minnesota agricultural communities have seasonal income dynamics. Farmers and agricultural workers may have stronger cash flow during and after harvest season. Some landlords in agricultural communities accommodate these patterns. One best practice for Minnesota landlords: set your late fee at a level that satisfies Section 504B 177's reasonableness requirement and reflects your actual administrative costs. Because the late fee is the exclusive remedy for late payment, you can't claim additional damages. The fee should fully but reasonably compensate you. Document your costs and set the fee accordingly. A fee of $40 to $75 is typical for the Twin Cities market. Another best practice: determine whether your property is in Minneapolis, St. Paul, or another city with local tenant protections. Build your late fee provision around the most restrictive applicable requirements. A provision that complies with Minneapolis's local rules will also comply with state law. A third best practice: include a grace period of at least 5 days and document it clearly in the lease. Minnesota's statutory expectation of a reasonable opportunity to pay before any fee is charged effectively requires a grace period. 5 days is the most common standard and satisfies this expectation. For the complete guide to Minnesota late fee laws, visit tenantscreeningbackgroundcheck.com. Subscribe to our channel for every state in our late fee law series.